For most of history, the ocean wasn't humanity's greatest enemy. Disease was. Not storms, not shipwrecks, not war. Disease. For thousands of years, the simple act of putting humans together on a wooden vessel turned ships into floating coffins. Entire crews vanished, not because of battle, but because sickness spread faster than wind ever could. Dysentery, typhoid, cholera, typhus. Invisible killers that required no cannon, no sword, no invasion, just time. And yet, right in the middle of this brutal reality, there exists a historical contradiction so strange that it almost sounds fake. A civilization that sailed with no toilets, no plumbing, no sanitation infrastructure of any kind. Men packed shoulder to shoulder on narrow wooden ships, weeks at sea, constant moisture, shared food, shared tools, shared air. By every rule of biology, they should not have survived. But they didn't just survive, they thrived. They crossed the North Atlantic centuries before anyone else dared to try. They reached Iceland, then Greenland, then North America. They raided, traded, explored, and returned home again and again with crews intact. While later, far more advanced naval empires were losing entire ships to disease within weeks. This is the story of the Vikings, and more importantly, it's the story of how they accidentally solved one of the deadliest problems in human history, without technology, without science, and without ever knowing what germs were. To understand why this matters, we need to rewind the clock and step onto a Viking longship. Imagine a wooden vessel about 30 meters long and barely wider than a modern truck. No deck below, no private spaces, no separation between work, sleep, eating, and survival. Around 60 men packed into that space. They row in shifts, they sleep between benches, they eat from shared provisions while salt spray soaks their clothes and smoke from small fires clings to everything. There is nowhere to go, no escape, no privacy. Every modern instinct screams that this should be a biological nightmare. One person gets food poisoning and the entire crew should be incapacitated within days. Lice should spread instantly. Dysentery should rip through the ship. Respiratory infections should explode in that cold, damp air. Now compare that to ships that came much later. British naval vessels in the 18th and 19th centuries had surgeons, they had regulations, they had designated sleeping areas, metal mess kits, and purpose-built toilets that flushed waste directly into the sea. And still, disease wiped them out. On some voyages, cholera killed more sailors than enemy fire ever did. Entire crews collapsed in weeks. Ships arrived at port carrying floating graveyards. So how did the Vikings, with none of that infrastructure, do better? The answer is uncomfortable, and it forces us to rethink what advanced actually means. When foreign observers encountered Vikings, they didn't describe filthy barbarians. They described something deeply unsettling for medieval Europe: clean people. An Arab diplomat named Ahmad ibn Fadlan wrote about watching Viking men wash themselves every single day. Not occasionally, not ceremonially, daily. English chroniclers actually complained that Vikings bathed every Saturday so consistently that the day itself became associated with washing. That's where the word Saturday in Scandinavian languages still traces its roots. Archaeologists later confirmed this obsession. Viking graves are filled with grooming tools. Combs carved from bone and antler, tweezers, ear cleaners, personal hygiene items placed alongside weapons and jewelry. This wasn't vanity, it was identity. But here's the paradox. How does a culture that values cleanliness so deeply survive on ships with absolutely no sanitation systems? No latrines, no waste containers, no designated areas. To answer that, archaeologists went looking for evidence, and what they found was shocking. In 1904, Norwegian farmers digging through blue clay near Oseberg uncovered one of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries of all time: A Viking ship preserved for over 1,000 years, sealed by peat that protected it from decay. It was nearly perfect. Researchers documented everything: wooden carvings, textiles, tools, kitchen vessels, buckets. But there was one thing they never found: nothing related to waste. No latrines, no waste containers, no designated areas. At first, some researchers suggested this ship might have been ceremonial, never meant for real voyages. So they waited for another discovery. They didn't have to wait long. The Gokstad ship, found earlier but studied more deeply later, was a real warship from around 890 AD. It showed clear signs of heavy use: reinforced structures, navigational equipment, water barrels. And again, the same absence: nothing for sanitation. Fast forward to the 21st century. Ground-penetrating radar scans of Viking ship remains confirmed the same pattern across centuries. Viking shipbuilders deliberately designed their vessels without permanent waste management systems. This wasn't ignorance, it was a choice. And that choice created both a terrifying problem and a brilliant solution. To understand it, we need to talk about a feature modern engineers would call a flaw. A Viking longship sat incredibly low in the water. The distance from the waterline to the edge of the ship was often less than half a meter. Stand at the side, and the ocean is right there, within arm's reach. That proximity wasn't accidental. It made the ships faster, lighter, and more flexible. But it also made something else possible. Waste didn't stay on the ship. It went straight into the ocean. There was no containment, no storage, no buildup. Nothing sat long enough to fester. In calm seas, waste went directly overboard and was instantly diluted by massive volumes of cold, moving salt water. From a microbiological perspective, which the Vikings did not understand, this mattered enormously. Most disease-causing bacteria need concentration to spread effectively. Containment systems, like barrels, pits, or enclosed spaces, allow pathogens to multiply. The Vikings did the opposite. They refused to contain anything. They eliminated waste immediately. In rough weather, when leaning over the side was dangerous, simple wooden buckets were used. But crucially, those buckets were never storage. They were temporary tools, emptied at the first opportunity, never allowed to sit. The ship was not treated as a sealed environment. It was treated as a platform passing through water. And the ocean didn't just receive waste, it erased it. But this alone doesn't explain Viking survival. Overboard disposal helps, but it doesn't account for weeks at sea, constant human contact, and limited space. The real genius appears when you realize something else about Viking ships. They were never meant to stay at sea for long. The longship's shallow draft, often less than 1 meter, meant it could beach almost anywhere. Sandy shores, gravel coasts, river mouths, places other ships could never reach. Instead of searching for ports, Vikings searched for land. And they found it constantly. Over 200 documented Viking landing sites stretch from Norway to Newfoundland. These weren't cities or docks, they were geographic reset points, fresh water sources, flat ground, protected beaches. Every few days, sometimes every day, crews would run the ship aground, step off into shallow water, and disperse. Suddenly, everything changed. Waste could be handled on land, where soil naturally processed it. Fires could be lit, clothes could be washed, bodies could be scrubbed with sand and cold water. The biological pressure of shipboard life vanished. The ship never became a permanent living space. It was temporary by design. At places like Torksey in England, what looked like a simple landing site turned out to be something much larger. Archaeologists uncovered evidence of a massive winter base, over 55 hectares, larger than many contemporary towns. Temporary structures, hearths, workshops, families living there for months. The Viking Great Army didn't just raid, it paused, it reset. and every reset prevented disease from ever gaining momentum. But this strategy had consequences. Trading centers like Hedeby and Birka show much higher levels of intestinal parasites in the soil. Vikings protected their crews by shifting sanitation burdens onto the land and the people living there. Brutally efficient. Still, even this wasn't enough. Waste disposal and frequent landings reduced risk, but they didn't eliminate the deadliest threat of medieval life: parasites. Lice and fleas were among the most dangerous disease vectors in history. Typhus alone killed millions across Europe. It spread not through dirty water, but through itching skin scratched by infested bodies. This is where Viking culture becomes the final piece of the puzzle. In Greenland, archaeologists found a woman's grave containing a double-sided bone comb. Its teeth were worn smooth from constant use, not occasional grooming, daily maintenance. English chroniclers noticed the same thing centuries earlier. Vikings combed their hair every day, bathed weekly, changed clothes often, and it made them attractive, dangerously attractive to local women. This wasn't fashion, it was survival. Daily combing physically removed lice before they could reproduce. Weekly bathing disrupted parasite life cycles. Social pressure enforced compliance. Showing up unkempt wasn't just unpleasant, it was shameful. Every crew member became part of a distributed health system. No doctors, no rules, just reputation. And remarkably, it worked. By accident, by necessity, and by culture, the Vikings created a system where disease struggled to gain a foothold. But there was still one invisible killer left: water. And solving that problem, without realizing it, may have been their greatest stroke of unintended genius. The most dangerous substance on any pre-modern ship was never fire, steel, or storms. It was water. Fresh water, once stored, becomes a biological weapon. Wooden barrels absorb organic matter into their grain. Bacteria cling to microscopic grooves and multiply in darkness. Within weeks, perfectly clear water turns lethal. This is one of the cruelest ironies in maritime history. The thing humans need most to survive becomes the thing that kills them at sea. By the 18th and 19th centuries, sailors feared the water barrel more than enemy cannons. Typhoid and cholera traveled invisibly inside casks, infecting entire crews long before symptoms appeared. Ships would leave port healthy and arrive weeks later carrying the dying. The Vikings avoided this nightmare almost entirely. Not because they understood bacteria, not because they had better containers, but because fresh water was impractical for them to carry. Water is heavy, brutally heavy. For longships designed for speed and shallow draft, hauling enough water for weeks would have destroyed performance. So the Vikings did something that later navies tried to avoid. They drank fermented liquids: weak beer, sour milk, whey. From a cultural standpoint, this made sense. Fermented drinks tasted better, lasted longer, and provided calories. From a microbiological standpoint, again, accidentally, it was revolutionary. Beer requires boiling. The grain-water mixture used to make beer is heated long enough to kill most human pathogens. The Vikings didn't know why boiling mattered. They just knew that beer didn't make people sick the way stagnant water did. Every barrel of weak beer on board represented gallons of pasteurized hydration centuries before pasteurization existed. Sour milk told a similar story. Lactic acid fermentation lowers pH, creating an environment hostile to many bacteria while preserving nutrition. It wasn't sterile, but it was vastly safer than stored fresh water. Later navies carried water and prayed it stayed clean. The Vikings carried drinks that actively resisted contamination. This single difference eliminated the primary killer of sailors for hundreds of years. But water wasn't the only hidden threat lurking below deck. In fact, Viking ships didn't even have a true below deck. Instead, they had something modern ship designers tried desperately to prevent: leaks. Those iconic overlapping oak planks, sealed with tar and animal hair, were never watertight. Seawater constantly seeped into the bottom of the ship. Archaeological finds consistently include wooden bailers because crews had to remove water constantly. To modernize, this sounds like poor engineering. It wasn't. It was another layer of accidental sanitation. Any organic debris that fell into the bilge, food scraps, spillage, bodily fluids, was immediately diluted with seawater and scooped out within hours. There were no stagnant pools, no anaerobic pockets where bacteria could thrive. The bilge was alive, dynamic, always flushing. Compare this to later ships with deep enclosed holds. Those holds collected weeks of standing water mixed with waste. Sailors called it bilge fever. It wasn't one disease, but a cascade of infections caused by prolonged exposure to decomposing organic matter. Viking ships never allowed stagnation. They leaked on purpose, or at least they accepted leakage as a feature and worked with it instead of fighting it. But even this layered system wasn't foolproof. Long voyages still meant close contact, fatigue, stress, and exposure. Which brings us to one of the strangest contradictions in Viking hygiene. According to Ibn Fadlan, Vikings washed themselves daily, but often using the same bowl of water, one after another. By modern standards, that's a perfect way to spread bacteria. And yet, it didn't destroy them. Why? Because hygiene doesn't need to be perfect to be effective. It just needs to be better than the alternatives. In medieval Europe, many people bathed only a few times a year. Clothes were rarely washed. Parasites thrived. Any disruption of that cycle, even an imperfect one, produced massive health benefits. Viking hygiene rituals reduced parasite loads dramatically, even if they didn't eliminate bacteria completely. This highlights a critical truth about disease prevention. You don't need advanced knowledge, you need consistency. Viking culture enforced cleanliness through reputation and shame. There were no inspections, no punishments, no written rules. If you smelled bad, looked unkempt, or brought lice into the group, you weren't just unpleasant, you were dangerous. And danger had social consequences. Now, compare this to the hyper-regulated navies of later centuries. British ships had rules for everything: where to sleep, where to eat, where to relieve yourself, where waste went. And yet, disease spread faster. Why? Because regulation doesn't equal resilience. Those ships created enclosed systems. They contained waste, they stored water, they kept men below deck for long periods, they centralized risk. Viking ships decentralized it. No single point of failure, no buildup, no place where disease could settle in and grow. Every design choice pushed contamination outward, into the sea, into the land, into dilution. Even their sailing strategy reinforced this philosophy. Vikings didn't follow fixed routes between major ports. They hugged coastlines, they entered rivers, they beached constantly. Each landing was a reset, biological, psychological, and logistical. Later navies stayed at sea for months, sometimes years, because their ships demanded deep harbors and infrastructure. The Vikings refused permanence. This refusal extended to authority itself. There was no centralized medical system on board, no ship's doctor monitoring symptoms, no quarantine procedures. Instead, health emerged from alignment. Ship design aligned with travel patterns aligned with cultural norms aligned with survival pressures. No one person controlled it, no one needed to understand it fully. And that's what makes it so unsettling. Modern civilization prides itself on control, on systems that monitor, regulate, and enforce. But control often creates fragility. When one element fails, everything collapses. The Viking approach was the opposite. Loose systems, rapid dispersal, constant movement. They didn't eliminate risk, they refused to let risk accumulate. And this philosophy extended beyond sanitation into warfare, trade, and exploration. When Vikings reached Greenland, they didn't build massive stone ports. They built flexible settlements that could be abandoned if conditions worsened. When resources ran thin, they moved. When disease appeared, they dispersed. Compare this to European cities centuries later, locked behind walls, with waste trapped in streets and water sources. Epidemics raged not because people were ignorant, but because systems were rigid. The Vikings weren't cleaner because they were morally superior. They were cleaner because their way of life punished stagnation. But there's still one question left unanswered. If Viking methods were so effective, why didn't everyone copy them? The answer lies in trade-offs. Viking sanitation worked because their ships were small, fast, and lightly crewed. Their voyages hugged land. Their culture accepted discomfort. Their social norms enforced hygiene. Large empires needed different things: cargo capacity, heavy cannons, deep holds, long blue water crossings. Those requirements forced containment, and containment made disease inevitable. In other words, Viking success came from embracing limits, not overcoming them. They didn't ask how to stay clean on ships for months. They asked how to avoid needing to. And that mindset changed everything. By the time European navies understood germ theory, thousands of years had passed. Billions had died. Entire systems had been built to manage problems that Vikings simply refused to create. Which leads us to the final layer of this story. What does this say about us? And what other primitive solutions did we abandon in favor of fragile complexity? Because the most unsettling lesson of all is this: the Vikings didn't beat disease by inventing something new. They beat it by understanding when not to build at all. When you step back and look at the Viking approach as a whole, something unsettling becomes clear. There was no single invention, no revolutionary device, no moment of discovery. What kept Viking crews alive was a system, and not a system designed on purpose, but one that emerged naturally from constraints, culture, and movement. Their ships refused containment. Their travel refused stagnation. Their culture refused neglect. Every element reinforced the others. Ship design forced immediate waste removal. Overboard disposal prevented buildup. Shallow drafts allowed constant landfall. Landfall enabled hygiene resets. Cultural norms enforced grooming. Grooming broke parasite cycles. Fermented drinks replaced unsafe water. Leaky hulls flushed contamination. None of this required scientific understanding. None of it required centralized control. It only required alignment. This is the part modern thinking struggles with. We are taught that progress means adding layers. More infrastructure, more systems, more safeguards, more rules. The Vikings did the opposite. They removed layers until problems couldn't exist long enough to matter. Instead of managing waste, they eliminated accumulation. Instead of storing water, they transformed it. Instead of sealing their ships, they left the ocean participate. And because of that, disease never found a foothold. What makes this story uncomfortable is not that Vikings were clever, it's that they were clever without knowing it. They never wrote treatises on sanitation. They never articulated theories of disease. They never claimed superiority. They simply observed what worked and ritualized it. Contrast this with the age of sail. European navies believed they had solved sanitation. They built heads, waste chutes, regulations, medical hierarchies. They trusted containment and authority, and they paid for it with lives. Entire crews died while following best practices. Ships with surgeons fared worse than ships without. The more infrastructure they added, the more places disease could hide. Viking ships had nowhere for disease to live. Even dignity was handled differently. There were no private spaces, no architectural solutions for modesty. Privacy was negotiated socially, not engineered structurally. Temporary screens at anchor. shared understanding, adaptation instead of permanence. This wasn't primitive, it was flexible. Flexibility is the true through line of Viking survival. Flexible ships, flexible routes, flexible settlements, flexible social rules. Nothing was designed to last forever. Everything was designed to move. And movement is poison to disease. Now, here's where this stops being history and starts being a mirror. Modern society loves containment. We store waste, store water, store people, store resources, store problems. We build systems meant to operate indefinitely. When they fail catastrophically. Hospitals struggle with superbugs. Cities struggle with waste management. Supply chains collapse when one node breaks. And in response, we add more layers, more controls, more regulation. Rarely do we ask whether the problem exists because of the system itself. The Viking lesson is not that we should copy their methods. We can't, and we shouldn't. It's that sometimes the smartest solution is to ask a different question. Not how do we manage this better, but why are we managing this at all? The Vikings didn't ask how to sanitize ships for months at sea. They asked how to avoid months at sea. They didn't ask how to store clean water. They asked what they could drink instead. They didn't ask how to control behavior. They shaped culture so behavior controlled itself. And that mindset allowed them to cross oceans that terrified everyone else. When they reached Iceland in 874 AD, it wasn't luck. When they reached Greenland by 985, it wasn't courage alone. When they reached North America around the year 1000, it wasn't a miracle. It was systems thinking without systems language. They designed life to make failure unlikely, not recovery impressive. And that may be the most modern idea of all. Because in an age obsessed with optimization, the Vikings optimized for resilience. They accepted discomfort to avoid catastrophe. They accepted imperfection to avoid collapse. They accepted limits to avoid fragility. This is why their ships didn't become floating death traps, not because they were clean in the modern sense, but because they never let dirt stay long enough to matter. So the next time we look back at ancient societies and call them primitive, it's worth pausing. They didn't have our technology, but sometimes they had something far rarer. They knew when not to build, and that knowledge carried them across the edge of the known world. If this story surprised you, there are countless others like it. Moments in history where intelligence didn't look like innovation, but like restraint. Where survival wasn't achieved by adding more, but by removing what wasn't necessary. If you want to explore more of those forgotten solutions, let us know in the comments. And if you found this perspective valuable, share it with someone who still believes progress only moves in one direction. Because sometimes the past isn't behind us, it's ahead of us, waiting to be remembered.